tools being tweezers that's normally used in clockwork. This is a watchmaker's tweezer. These are used quite a bit in clockwork, particularly the smaller clocks. This tweezer here is probably 40 or more years old, dates back to my watchmaker's apprenticeship, and I suppose is the favorite tweezer that I use. This is a number 3, Swiss made. You will notice that the tips, the points, are very close together. The spring back in it is quite soft. It is easy to handle. It can be laid on edge to be picked up easily, or the edges are beveled here, so it's easy to lift apart and roll it between your fingers while holding the piece. Now, this tweezer, I stated, is something over 40 years old, no doubt. It's a size 3 or a style 3 in the Swiss tweezer. Here is a tweezer of the same style. It is newer. Notice that there is considerable difference in the length of them. That shows that this tweezer has been broken, repaired, worn, reworked many times in its life. But this in no way detracts from its functionality. So first, we'll talk about we need a good, strong tweezer. The things that are important on a tweezer is its backbone here. It should be welded together or riveted or however that it's fastened so that it's rigid and tight, and that keeps the tips parallel with each other. They need to be of the same length on the tip end, and that's corrected from time to time by a stoning operation. This is a little India stone here. It should have some oil on it. You stone it in that mode. The sides need to be smooth and parallel. That's best done on a piece of abrasive paper like this. And we turn over and again. And in addition to that, the tips need to come together so that with whatever the functional pressure that we will use as we squeeze, that they will be parallel. Also, they need to be slightly textured so that as we pick up small parts, they don't flip or slide out of it. To correct this situation, what we do, we take a small plier, and in this region, we form the tips inward. I would bend this in or in, and ever so slightly, and then we finish that on a piece of abrasive paper by catching like this and giving it a pull. A few pulls, turn the tweezer over, do the same thing again, and that gives us a slight textured inner surface that is parallel and flat. This is very important to be able to handle small pieces without losing them. The next thing that we want to do is set the spacing between the tweezer tips. The spacing should be no more than is necessary to conveniently pick up the pieces that's going to be handled. For instance, we don't want a tweezer that has spacing out like this, because you have to fight that spring with your hand every minute that you're using it. So the question comes, how do we cope? How do we adjust this spacing? This isn't really commonly known, but it's very simple. If I want to increase that spacing, I hold the tweezer in its backbone here and pull out on the handle, on the tips, like this. I've increased the spacing. Never, ever stretch them like this. You may pull the backbone apart and then totally destroy the tweezer. We now see that we have the wider grasp for this if we need to pick up something that is larger. Now the question is, how do we close the tips? Catch this, pull it together, take it in the backbone, and flex it a few times. All right, we see that we have returned. We have softened the grip, and we've returned to the close spacing again. So this is the type of adjustments and maintenance that we need on a tweezer. A number 3 tweezer is a general purpose tweezer for the watchmaker. It's one that he commonly uses in assembly. It's small enough. If the tips are in good shape, you can do some minimal amount of hairspring work with it. You can lift the smallest of the screws or the largest of the parts that's in the watch. It's a great utility tweezer. The original size of the number 3 is a little longer than this. You see the difference in the two lengths here. This one has been repaired, stoned, reworked many times over the years, and actually I like the shorter, blunter tip that this has now than on the original number 3 shape. The reason being, I have a greater sense of feeling as my finger grip is closer to the work, and being a little more blunt, that works out well. So much for the repair of the tweezer. All right, let's look at this particular tweezer here, and let's look at some of the merits and demerits of various tweezers. This one is a Swiss style AA. It is in stainless steel. Many people prefer the stainless steel tweezers. I do not, simply because the stainless steel tweezer is a bit softer in the tips than is the steel tweezer. Consequently, it requires a more frequent rework. This particular tweezer looks nice, well made, but I do not find it as with as much utility as the one that we previously looked at, because it's heavier in the backbone right here. It's made of thicker material. That means that it's more difficult to flex, and it's more difficult to spread the tips. So if you need to open or close, which you frequently do, may do this essentially every day, this one is not as readily adjustable. It's just a mite heavier. It possibly is better for clockwork than the number 3 that we looked at previously. Let's take a look at this one. This is also a stainless steel, number 3. This one is softer in the backbone and is easier adjusted. Let's take a look in this one. This is called a 00 or a double alt. I don't know which it's called. This is a Swiss style. And we find that it's considerably heavier. Notice the thickness of the stock here. Notice the angle on the tips, the thickness in the back, and this region, and here. This is a heavier tweezer with finer points. Many like this particular one, but I personally don't like the strength of the spring that's in it. If you would like to adjust that situation, the strength of the spring, this can be done if you have a little drum sander or a little belt sander or whatnot. If you'll go into the back section here on the flat and thin this material right in here, you can soften up the feel of it. Say, well, what's the feel of the spring of the tweezer? Well, there's no point in fighting an excess spring all day long and every day of your work. Let's try a little further. This is a double aught tweezer, Swiss style, by a different maker. This tweezer here is a 2C. The 2C is similar to the first one we looked at. It's not quite as lightweight. It has long and thin tips. It's good for hairspring work in watches and also in the hairsprings of clocks. 2C is a pretty nice tweezer. It's quite popular among watchmakers and clockmakers. This is a number 55 here, and this is not one that I would recommend for much of anything. The backbone is very strong here. This is very strong. The tips are quite heavy, and it requires considerable grip to close this down to zero. If you're only going to do a few minutes work, you probably won't notice that. If you work with that tweezer all day, it will work you down with that spring that's in it. Let's look at this. This is a hairspring working tweezer. This is called a number 5, a Swiss number 5 style. I suppose I've had this tweezer for 20 or more years. I also have a number 5 that's about 40 years old. Let's look at the difference in the length of the two. Both of these were the same out here to begin with, but a tweezer is something that you never discard. You always work the points down. You adjust them from time to time. Hardly a week will go by that you don't need to make some adjustment, either by retouching the finish in the jaw and the abrasive, or by evening the length of the ends on the stone, or by removing burrs on the sides like this. And as time goes on, the tweezer simply works into a different application. By example, let's take a look at this tweezer here. If we look on the handle of this, we find that's a number 3C. 3C on the back on this section. That is a little bit lighter weight and a little more pointed tweezer than the first one that we looked at. But they're considerably different in their function now. This is the case where one has been altered as it was worn and used for another application. Here is the first one that we looked at, and here is the second one. These were originally the same length. Here is what happened to this one. Actually, I distinctly recall what happened to this particular tweezer. I dropped it one day, and when it hit the floor, and this was in the days of wooden floors, one of these tips stuck up in the floor, and it went kind of twang up on the top, and then it went plink, and it broke off about 1/2 or 5/8 of an inch back on one of these prongs. And I was bemoaning this situation, and an old craftsman told me, he said, "Son," says, make you a roller remover out of it." And he told me how to do this, and that's what come out of this. I set this on the grinder, ground away this shape right here, this sway back shape, evened off the ends, went under the bottom, turned this back a little, spread the points. There's a space between the points here, and put a bevel on the two sides right here. Now, on the small ladies' wristwatches, when you're replacing a balance staff, you just simply take this and slip it underneath the roller. Just slip it up underneath the roller and give it a couple of wiggles like this and lift up, and that becomes the roller puller that pulls the roller from the balance staff. Continuing, let's look at another tweezer or so of an unusual shape. This particular tweezer here is a Swiss pattern number 6. This is very fine points. These are hairspring handling type of tweezer points, and presumably many workmen like this for hairspring work. Actually, I am disenchanted with this particular style for this simple reason. It appears that the primary use of this tweezer is in this form of being held, that you hold it back to the palm of your hand with your finger over the top, something in this order. Being that I personally prefer, and this is personal preference, I prefer to hold the tweezer much as I would a pencil, like this. And if I hold this tweezer like unto that, I lose the ability to come straight down onto the point in a hairspring. So though this is a very nice tweezer, it, for all practical purposes, just falls completely out of my personal appearance in tweezers. I do use it occasionally for something, but it's not one that I would go out and purchase again. We find another hairspring tweezer. This is a number 7 Swiss style. Let's take a look at the tips on this, curved off over like this, and very, very finely made points. This is a very expensive tweezer. As a matter of fact, the previous one is quite expensive also. But for the same reason, I really don't particularly care for it. Now, it does meet the objection, or obviate the objection that they had in the other. I can hold this pencil style and be straight down into the work. But in reality, I do not prefer to change the size or the shape of a tweezer from use to use on a job, because it requires a change of your hand motion and your sense of touch. So those are very nice pieces. I would not really recommend that these are purchased for the clockmaker's use. This is the number 5 that has been used for so many years that the tip has been shortened on, and I really prefer to use that in the hairspring work. And if I need to get straight up, I use it straight up and down in my hand, but normally like this. Let's look at something that's a little more different. Here's a tweezer that's called a D style. This is a Swiss style D. What this is an end nipper. This has cutting jaws in the end, and it's primarily used to cut taper pins or small pieces of wire or whatever that you need as a clipper. When I bought this tweezer many years ago, I thought that was going to be the answer to many of the needs, and I turned out that I never really developed the use of this as I had expected to. There's some other tools that we'll look at a little further along the way that I believe that I'll show you that completely obviates the reason to own one of this type. Let's look at this one. That is a pretty rough, tough looking tweezer. This is not very functional for the watchmaker, but certainly this is my favorite in most of the clockwork. And why? It has a flexible backbone, so I can easily close the tips. I can readily open them. They are thick, blunt, and strong. And by pulling this onto a piece of abrasive paper, I can have a textured surface inside and keep this quite parallel. Remember that in the use of a tweezer, tweezers are like screwdrivers, like wrenches, like many other things. There is no universal tweezer, there is no universal screwdriver, there is no universal wrench. You might say, well, the crescent wrench approaches that, some of these types of things. But remember, if that tweezer stands wide enough that the tips are no longer parallel, whatever you pick up with it is expelled from the end of it like squeezing a grape. So the tips of these tweezers need to be in accordance with the size of the pieces that you're going to lift, and also the strength and the placement of them. And the tips need to be very near parallel and textured at the spacing that you normally use them. This is a strong tweezer. It's a very good one for the clockwork. As a matter of fact, this is the only one that I've ever owned like this. I'm not even sure that this is the way it was originally made. This is a style H. This is a Swiss style H. I found that in an automobile mechanic's toolbox, rusty as a plow. I said, I need that. And he says, it's all yours. He says, it has no value. It's all rust. I've scrubbed the rust off of it, cleaned it up, and it is really one of my favorite clockmaking tweezers. This is my favorite number 3. Let's look at this one. This is an unusual tweezer. This was supposed to be a universal tool that does everything for everybody. I have an idea that that tweezer cost a bundle of money. This has a Schwarzschild Company trade name on it, and it has a sliding lock back in the grip here. And as we slide that lock up, we find here is a series of holes, graduated size of holes. Then they get bigger here, some slots in this area. We turn it over, this is curved down here, and this is some V slots in this region. Now this tweezer is supposed to be the fix-all, fit-all for everything. And if you have the particular application for it, it is very nice. The purpose of this tapered section here and the rocking base, this is a roller remover. We discussed the roller remover made from the old tweezer a little earlier. This is a roller remover. It's to go underneath the roller, and this would be somewhat like wristwatch, men's wristwatch size. You would go under the roller, you would give it a squeeze up against it, and give it a little rock, and work the roller loose and pull it from the balance staff. That's the purpose of this. It might be imagined as being a pin clipper because the edges in there are quite sharp. You might cut a tiny taper pin, such as is used to anchor the hairspring into the collet of a watch. The holes that are back here are imagined to be used for broaching hands. If you have a hand that you're fitting to a watch, you catch the hub in one of these holes, and you lock up the tweezer with the hand in there, and now you can pass a brooch through the hole to size the hands, or possibly a cannon pinion, or whatever. That's the purpose of this specialized tweezer. I found that I think it was in a antique shop one time, and no one knew what it was for, and walked away with it for almost nothing, and sometimes wonder why. All right, so that's the tweezer situation, and about how that we take care of the tweezers. Let's extend this a little further and talk about a pair of pliers. Pliers seems to be the next step up from tweezers. So let me grab a few pliers and we'll be right back. Looking through the plier group here, let's see what we have and what kind of application that we can use these for. This is a diagonal cutting plier. This is really an electronics workers type of tool. This is made by Utica, and it's chrome plated, highly polished, looks beautiful in someone's service case. Has a notch in the jaw right here for supposedly for wire stripping. That is touted as being the greatest. It is a very nice plier. Let me show you the problem with it. Let's talk about the problem with the plier, the demerit of it. Number one, This plier is primarily made to cut, not to strip. And everything that you set in this jaw to cut wants to fall in that stripping notch. That notch is nothing more than a nuisance to the workman. I would prefer never to have a stripping notch in the jaw of a diagonal plier. The second thing, I don't particularly like polished and chrome-plated handles. They're too slick in your hand. They do not handle good when you use them extensively. The plier is very great. It's very nicely made. If I had my preference, they would not be polished and chrome. The chrome is all right, but if the surfaces were textured and without the notch. This is a good tool for the clockmaker. Has a great amount of utility. Let's discuss one more thing while we're on this plier, because we'll be looking at several cutting types of pliers. This jaw here is sharpened at two angles. It's sharpened from the inside, like this, and it's sharpened from the outside, like this. Now, these two jaws, the knife edge comes together, edge on edge, and whatever we cut, it goes snap, and the little piece flies one direction, and the other piece is pushed back in the opposite direction. It's all right if you're cutting wire. There are many things in clockwork where you want to cut up close, where you make a close cut, and you want the cut to be very clean. And this is not a particularly suitable jaw for that. Nothing wrong with this plier for what it's made for. Let's look at another similar plier. This is made by Matthias Klein Company, and it has no plating on it at all. The brightness on it is just from the hand wear for many years. It does not have the stripping notch in the jaw. The jaws are sharpened the same way as the one that we just looked at, has the same objection there, but this is a very good utility cutting plier. Let's look at this one. This is made by Matthias Klein Company also. This particular plier, and I've used this for many, many years, it was about this much longer on the tip end when it was new. It is badly worn, and if you'll watch the tip out here, you can see the joints. The hinge joint is badly worn, and these two ends do not come down parallel to each other. The tip end that was so badly worn, the teeth in it have worn away. It's been cut back, and it's a good rough plier. It is not one that is good for fine and careful work. Let's look at this one. This plier here is this is also made by Klein, and this has a slight serrated tip inside of each jaw, right down here. It has the classic chain nose, but not the smooth jaw. This plier fits my hand very well. I have a small hand, and it fits quite well. I like a plier that my thumb reaches to approximately the pivot joint. This gives me the reach for a good feel for the work that I'm carrying on. This is a nice little plier, has a lot of use. Let's look at this one. This is made by Crowder Tools, and it's an end nipper. You will recognize that this has the same general type of end that the D-tweezer has. The D-tweezer is a cutter. This is a cutter in the end. The difference between the D-tweezer and this plier is that the D-tweezer is sharpened on a radius over the outside, this radius around the outside here, and in so doing you can cut very, very close, right up against whatever you want. If you wanted to clip a taper pin off that comes through a surface, you can go right down tight against it and give it a clip. When this plier cuts, it pulls up on, when this tweezer cuts, it pulls up on the object that's being clipped off. And as such, it's a good pin clipper. This plier has the jaws sharpened exactly like the diagonal pliers, the diagonal cutter that we looked at a little earlier. And consequently, when it makes a cut, it pulls one piece this way, pushes the other piece the other way. That is not very good for a close cut in many places. This is a very nice little tool, but it turns out that it just doesn't have much application to the clockmaker. See what happens with this plier. See if we can see who made this one. This is made by Dymalloy. This is a Dymalloy tool. It has an unferrous pivot here. It's supposed to never bind up. And originally this plier was some 5/8 or so inch longer than it is today. Over a period of time and use, the teeth become quite worn, and out in the tip of it, the tip didn't come together well. So this plier has been cut off. The tip has been cut off. From this angle, we have tapered the sides here somewhat and made this into a miniature duckbill plier. This is yet a good, strong little duckbill plier with good parallel jaws. The jaws are parallel, perfectly parallel when we're open about 60 or 70 thousandths of an inch. I don't particularly like the plastic handles. The reason I don't like the plastic handles is because it softens the feel for the work you're doing. That takes some of the response, the feedback from the work into your hand and into your understanding. Many people are very pleased with the soft handles. The handles may be of various colors so that pliers that are similar can be identified by the color of the handles. If you like that, that's great. I don't particularly like them. The plier fits the palm of my hand and the reach extremely well. Let's talk about one more thing. Back here in the joint pivot area, there's a hole in each of the handles. This originally had a spring in it to open the plier. That is, if you'd lay the plier down, it would be open. Every time you pick it up, it would be open. You pick it up, you close it. I pull all the springs out of my tools. I don't particularly like those. There's just, I find no logical reason to fight that spring every time I pick that plier up. Also, a plier that's picked up that's nearer your hand size is easier to pick up and get in your grasp than one that's standing quite open. The reason, I suppose the reason for the spring to be put in there is to open the plier. But I personally don't know anything wrong with holding a plier like this. That plier opens and closes with your hand action with the little finger. So I don't, my personal preference doesn't go for the spring, and I remove those from the tools that I have. This little plier, how about that? That's a Crowder tool, nice little cutter. Let me tell you what's wrong with it. That would be my favorite plier if I would just, of the type, if I would just take a glance at it. But when I pick it up, I've got to close my hand too tight to close the jaw. My hand is not comfortable that tightly closed if I have to put the grip in it. Notice the difference in the spacing between the handles. Simply, there's nothing wrong with the tool. Certainly nothing wrong with it. It's nice. It just doesn't fit my hand very well. Let's try another. Here's one. This one originally had the spring in the jaw, which is gone, has the soft handle. Notice the long, thin nose on this. Let me tell you something about that. That long, thin nose doesn't have any more strength than a tweezer of that size. And if you lay into anything of any consequence with these handles here, size of the grips that's on this, you can ruin the tip of that plier in just about one pickup. A good strong tweezer will do everything this plier will do, and is easier and simpler to handle and can be more readily held as a pencil would. So though this is a very nice plier, very nicely made, it's not one that I really get excited over. This is made by Exolite. Let's try this one. This is another diagonal cutter, and this is made by Utica Tools. The tool is rather short, rather short. It fits my hand quite well. It's had the spring removed. I don't particularly like the soft grip. Notice here that this is sharpened over a radius on the outside here. All of your sharpening is done on the outside. That means that this plier can go right up against, skin tight against something, and cut very, very close, like the D-tweezer. This has all of the function of the D-tweezer, the cutting ability, plus it has more strength in it. You can get just as close, cut just as clean, and as such, this is a more preferable tool to own than the D-tweezer. If we're using this to cut, for instance, a piece of wire like this, it just snips right off. The end of that piece of wire, that cut off, is essentially square across, and that is a very nice function of this particular plier. Let's look at this one. The trade name on this says Lindstrom, Sweden. This is a plier that I guard very carefully and only use for a specific purpose. This is a diagonal cutting plier, about as we've been looking, but these jaws are very, very sharp. This has a box joint. This plier has a box joint here, which is very tight. There's essentially zero slack in these handles. The tips come together very close. This plier is reserved in my tools for one purpose and one purpose only. And that is to close the collet of a hairspring on a balance staff. The way you use this, you slip or you lay the hairspring down on a flat surface and slip this plier over it, and on the hub of that collet, you just pinch it ever so slightly. These teeth are sharp enough, perfect enough, that if you have a shoulder or a space above the spring as much as 10 or 15 thousandths of an inch, you can very easily close a hairspring collet, not damage the spring or anything there. That is one of the difficult jobs that you have in watchmaking, and that's what I reserve that plier for. I have another plier here that essentially is used for the same purpose. It's a little bigger, opens a little wider, a little bit stronger. This cuts right up against the wall, and it's sharpened in the same way as the Lindstrom plier. And if we look in the handle of this, we find that this says Revlon Professional 2124. This is a manicurist nail clipper. That is probably as fine a tool as you can ever obtain for closing hairspring collets. This has a spring in the handle that can be moved around for spring opening or turned around the other way. I keep it around this way. This plier appears to be about the same thing. It does not have the box joint. The jaws are not as perfect in it. It has a curve underneath here. And this is a nail clipper, a manicurist nail clipper. And on the inside of it, it says well, it doesn't say. I thought that it said, here it is. It says Sheffel Brothers, Newark, New Jersey. It has the spring in the jaw. It has a red cross or a bandage, not a red cross, but a cross bandage on it, something there. About the only thing I can say that is really nice about this is the jaws are so soft they're easy to sharpen. But alas, they get dull just as easy. Oh, it does say lacrosse right there. But this plier is best left to clipping your fingernails. Another Utica. This is another diagonal plier. This is a smooth jaw. This is made by Crowder, and this one has a perfectly smooth and parallel jaw inside. This is good for forming small pieces, wire, strips, strip stock, whatnot. This is a very useful tool. This one, I don't really know how I come across this one. This is totally smooth jaw, and I can do this and flex those jaws right on my finger. There is not as much strength in the tips of that plier as there is in some of the tweezers that we looked at a little earlier. This says this is Swiss made and undoubtedly has some unique and special purpose for which that it is very good, but I've never found that in the clock shop. This little plier is called a chain nose, and it is made by Matthias Klein. A good little plier, quite useful. Another little chain nose plier. This one's been in my toolkit. This is Crowder. It's been in my toolkit for many, many, many years. It's chain nose, smooth on the inside, and things that I want to hold that I don't want to mar, I need to hold tight. I use this one very, very frequently. Very good little plier. Another Crowder cutter. Another fingernail clipper. This one does not have a box joint. It's loose in the joint. It's best left for the fingernails. We look a little farther. We find here is a little scissor that I come across at some point in time. If you're cutting strips of gold solder or silver solder or whatnot that's in sheet stock, that's a nice little scissor. I don't know how I come across this, but it's not something that I would immediately run out and buy as a primary tool. These hemostats, they have their application and use. A couple of these. There's many times I use them, but they're not what you would call first and primary tools. They're niceties for the toolkit. Let's look at this one. Here's one that gets lots of use. This is I don't know who made this one, but I do remember something about it. When I got a hold of it, it was at least an inch longer when I first got it. I obtained it secondhand somewhere. This is Utica Tools. I found it right there in the side of it. It's about an inch longer. This was a long nose plier. This tapered right down to a tiny sharp point. And whoever owned it previously had laid into a big nut or I don't know what, bolt, stretched the ends of it, and it was of no value. It had plastic handles on it, which I trimmed off with a knife. I cut this back, cut the tip off, tapered this, and this become a good, strong duckbill plier. It has lots of utility. A duckbill plier has lots of utility. So that's the things that we look at here, and the kind of tipped and tong tools. A good pair of scissors is probably one of the most useful tools that you will have in the clock shop. This particular pair of scissors says Deluxe Clean Cut, spelled with a K, K-L-E-E-N-C-U-T. I picked these things up somewhere cast off. They wouldn't cut when I got them. I tightened up the rivet, sharpened the jaws in them. One of the things you need to do as a clockmaker is to learn to care for your tools and to restore them. Sharpening scissors is not as easy as sharpening a pocket knife. Anyway, sharpen these, ground off. I can see on the end here where I ground away some of this tip. I don't recall, but I suspect that when I got this, that the tip end of one of these had been broken off. There's a place back here in the jaw that I ground on it so that I could close them down and bring this to a point out here. And let me show you a function that these will perform. Let's take this piece of suspension spring steel right here. This is a piece of suspension spring steel. Let me show you what we can do here. You can just cut that like that. So these pieces is trimmed off the end. That's what a good strong scissor will do, and that doesn't necessarily damage the scissor. Let's just look at this little piece of paper towel that we have here. You can go back into this and cut that up also, and as time comes, sharpen them up. But you'll find that a good heavy pair of scissors is a great aid in the clock shop. Let's look at sharpening some tool bits. This particular stone that I'm using here is an aluminum oxide stone. The tool bit that I'm using is a handheld graver for working with the watchmaker's lathe. This tool bit is about scantly 1/8 of an inch square. The handle is a wooden dowel that's been turned with a little piece of copper tubing on it. The bore was slightly smaller than the tool itself. This was driven into place. I have a handful of these that's made in that manner. Works out quite well. You take a piece of graver stock and cut it into several pieces. A piece of graver stock 6 inches long will make about 3 of these tools. This particular one, as we look at it, we can see the, see if I can look in the monitor, we can see the surface. It's simply angled on a lozenge graver, lozenge-shaped graver. This side of the graver is slightly rounded to give it a ever so slight round nose. I sharpen this by going on to this aluminum oxide stone. Use a little WD-40 on it because that's convenient. A little kerosene probably works better, but along the stone, I'll have to turn this a little different angle to do the job, but this is how it's held. And I strike the tool in this direction, never moving it in my hand, but I move my lower fingers so that I can progress across the block, across the stone. I don't want to cut a groove in the stone. And this is done until such a time that the judgment says that the edges are brought to sharp. Then I lay the surfaces flat and strike it this way on the stone, ever so slightly, turn it 1/4 of a turn, and do so again. Now, let's look at it and see what the situation is like. I find this is very sharp on the end, also down the side. That's all there is to it. Let's take another one and try the same situation. I'll try to find the flat that I'm working on to get it down and to fit the original angle, so it takes the minimum amount of stroking to do this. Keep the stone wet, keep it completely wet all the time, so that there is no metal particle loading into the stone. Continuing here, kind of squeaky sounding. You may hear that on the monitor. I don't hear it because I normally wear a hearing aid when I'm in the company of people. At this point, I don't have it in my ear, so I don't hear much of anything. All right, we'll turn the next corner and see what we have here, and we'll try that one. We're sharp there. This is the graver that I've been using most. This is the fine, very fine point that I usually sink a center with. And that, as I mentioned in the previous tape, I had dug by being overzealous in my cutting rate. We'll see what we can do with this. So if we can bring that back to order, find the flat on this. This has a round shank back here, so it's a little more difficult to locate the flat when we're sharpening. We go there, and we turn it a quarter of a turn and see if we can locate that flat. See how we did, and we're fine. All right. The thing that you've seen here is essentially sharpening by touch, not by sight. And we have some more here. I won't sharpen those at this particular time. The stone that is underneath this is a hard Arkansas stone. This is a dark brown stone. And if you desire to finish this to the very finest point, then we might finish off on that particular stone. If I were turning a hard balance staff for a watch, I would certainly do that for the things that I'm going to be turning. I do not do it. These stones are kept wrapped between some pieces of paper, kept oil wet, because that helps to obviate the loading of metal particles. We'll reach across the camera here and set them over where they're customarily stored, and that'll set our tools in cutting order for the next item that we want to do. Let me talk about one more plier that I didn't mention a few minutes ago. Of course, I have many pliers that I didn't mention a few minutes ago, but I want to show you one here. I suppose of all the pliers that I have, this is probably my pride and joy. An old craftsman had one of these things when I was a young man, and I wanted one so bad. And would you believe, right at the end of World War II, that one of these things cost about $20? That's as much money as I made in a week as an apprentice. Well, when I become economically affluent, I ordered one of these from a supply house. They were still in the catalogs. I told them if it wasn't over, I've forgotten what, it was like, wasn't over $75, I wanted one. They wrote back and says they're not anymore at any price. Not too many years ago, I was out at Victor, Colorado on vacation, and I went into an antique shop. And that antique shop was it was across the street and about 3 or 4 doors down from where Mr. Orville Higgins, the renowned horologist, had his jewelry store in the late 1920s. I went in this antique shop and I looked around and I looked and I looked and I looked. And I spotted that plier. And when I did, I really had palpitation of the heart, because I didn't know what they would ask me for it. So I looked at everything in there, and the proprietor wanted to sell me this or that, and finally I kind of sheepishly asked him, I said, "What is that thing?" I said, "Is that something you pull teeth with?" He says, "I don't know what that is." He says, "I think that's something that you use in manufacturing jewelry." I said, "How much do you want for it?" He says, "About $7. I like to broke my arm off getting $7 out and paying for it. Let me show you what it is. This is a mainspring plier. Right here in the end of this, there's a little lance and a die, and you can slip that over the barrel, over a mainspring barrel, and you can lance the hook in the barrel that the mainspring hooks onto in many of your old watches. If that hook becomes broken out of the barrel, broken in the barrel, you just simply move over and that will place another hook inside the barrel. These 4 punches here, one is round, the other 3 are 3 sizes of rectangular punches. Watch this. We talked about this being a piece of suspension spring stock. I've got that sitting up in this with a punch up in this die on it. Possibly you can hear. Listen. Check that out and see what we got. There's the prettiest little hole you ever saw in that suspension spring. Didn't distort the spring at all. Look at that. If we move over one position on this, same thing. Come out. Here is a pretty little rectangular hole in that. And that's just the nicest thing that a clockmaker ever owned. Because your suspension spring can begin as bulk stock, and it's very simple to cut the holes in it. We talked about the scissor. Look at this. Holes that I did not want. We cut the end off of that steel stock with that scissor. So this is how that you handle some of the spring materials. I don't know if I can punch a hole in this spring here or not. I believe this hole is going to cut the spring in two. Let's see. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. Look at here. See that through that spring? So I suppose of all the pliers that I own, I'm prouder of this one than any of the others. That is a real prize. All right, let's bring this to an end, and we will continue on here a little later on another subject matter. Continuing with the Huckabee Random Clock Talk, we're continuing to work with the little trapeze movement, and we're going to talk about a bushing problem for the escape wheel pivot. This is the location of the escape wheel pivot in this movement, and we're going to make an assumption that we have a particular problem here, and the correction of that problem in installing a bushing. The problem does not literally exist in this movement, but we will go through the steps as if it does. problem that I'm alluding to is particularly found in so-called antique American-made clock movements, in which the wear over the years has caused this pivot hole to drift to a substantially elongated hole. The direction of the driving wheel causes the drift of that pivot with the wear, and when we rebush that hole, it is presumptuous to assume that we can go in and ream that hole and press in a bushing and the depthing in the gearing be correct. Oftentimes we find the wear so bad that the mesh of the gearing is such that the movement just would not run if the bushing were replaced at the current position of the hole. Now, we will deal with how to get this hole back in place and how to deal with that in making the bushing. Remember that if we ream a hole that is elongated, most bushing tools, most commercial bushing tools, most handmade tools, most reamers, most drilling, whatever it may be, will approximately center on the mean position of the elongated hole. The rigidity and the strength of the small reamers and the tools that's used is just presumptuous to believe that we can go back totally and completely into the original position. Now, what we're doing is the assumption that this hole has drifted off, that we will rebush this, and that we will set the train back into its proper position. To do this, we need a little tool to locate the hole, locate the location of the new pivot hole. This little tool here is a triangular shaped piece of brass, about 1/16 of an inch thick. Its longer dimension is about 1 3/8 of an inch, and there are 3 pins that are press fit into this, and it sits as a little 3-legged table. The pins are very tightly pressed in here and sharpened to a scribe point on the ends. I don't know the name of this tool, and I've never seen one that was commercially made. The renowned clockmaker, Mr. J.E. Coleman, in a discussion with him once upon a time, I asked him, I said, "Mr. Coleman, what do you call that tool?" He says, "I have no earthly idea," but he says, "One old clockmaker called it a preacher." And he says, "Why a preacher?" He says, "Well, it's supposed to speak the truth. And that's what this tool is for, is to speak the truth for the position of the pivot hole." Now, here's how we use this. In a previous bushing discussion, I talked about using a depthing tool or a pair of depthing tools to relocate pivot positions. Really, that is a more cumbersome method than using this simple little device. Let's assume this pivot has drifted off in some direction, and we can work this plate either from the back side or the front side. This is the rear plate of the particular movement, and the drift is usually in the plate that is nearest the pinion associated with the pivot that has drifted. In this case, it would be the rear plate, and I think I'll work this from the inside of the plate for convenience of avoiding conflict with the pillars. It can be done equally well either way. We lay this on a sturdy, hard-surfaced bench block so that it's very flat, and we drop this little tool in place into the pivot hole. Now, as we drop this in place, I have one of the pivots sitting in the pivot hole that we intend to correct. Now let's look at this. looking around these pins in the tool, you see a dark ring around this one and not so on these. That's so that I can identify that particular pin. Now, the objective is to drop this into the pivot hole, and if the hole has drifted, we are to, by sight and with a strong glass, move the position of that pivot, or that pin, that locator, to the best of our eye view, to the position, the original position that the pivot was in. Let's see if we can turn this around maybe for a little better camera view. I seem to have my finger in it, no matter how that I approach this. Possibly here, possibly here. Over the bench block, located in the position of the pivot, and hold down. Now we take the hammer, and we want these pins, these remaining two pins, to be on a place, a location in the movement that's not in a conflict with other pivot holes. We do that. We do this. Now when we lift this off, we find, and let's see if we can locate this in the camera. Here is a tiny prick mark right here and right here. Now, based on this tool being returned to those prick marks, we can locate the position that the pivot was originally in, like this. Now, our objective will be to go into this hole, open it up, press in a bushing, if you will. It will be a plug. It will be as a bushing with no hole in it. We press that plug in there, we fill the hole, finish off the surface, have everything complete. Then we will return with the tool and prick the bushing, or prick the plug that's in there. We will prick that plug, then we will drill the hole in the plug, and when we have drilled the hole, we will finish it out with the oil sink and broach it to size and whatnot, and we will have returned this pivot to its original position. This is a simple hand tool. It's quite easy to use. The process is simple, and if you're careful when you make the first measurement, it's just almost impossible to go wrong. And you can restore the depthing and the gearing and have the new bushing and have a very, very satisfactory repair. Ordinarily, when we do this, we'll find that the bushing may be off, the hole in it may be slightly off center. It is well when we do this that as we ream or drill that we attempt to center on the original pivot position. If we can, fine. If we can't, we still come out with the job being completely satisfactory. Now, I don't think there's any point in me showing machining up a bushing or a plug, as we did that on a previous random clock talk tape. I will drill this hole out, and in so doing, I will use the bushing reamer, which we used on the previous talks. This is a handmade reamer. Let's see if we can get this in line of view here, possibly here. Let me give you a description. This is a piece of drill rod. It was turned to a precision shank diameter right in this region, right here. That diameter is 3 millimeters, namely about 119 thousandths of an inch. And then from that point on out to the tip, the reamer tapers. This is tapered. Then it has been ground away to a D-section. One side is cut away to a D-section, which makes this now a cutting reamer down in this region. It will cut turning either clockwise or counterclockwise. And as we go into a hole, it's not necessarily necessary to drill and ream. We can go into a small hole, this in a drill press, and a small drill press. And as we ream up, it increases the diameter of the hole, and when we pass into this section, it burnishes the inside of the hole at 119 thousandths of an inch, or 3 millimeters. I make up the bushings. When I make these bushings, I usually make a string of them. We have some on a hairpin here that have been made up previously. None of these are suitable because these all have holes in them. We're going to make up one without a hole in it. And these are turned from hard bronze stock, very hard bronze stock. They're very fine bushings, and they're turned with ever so slight taper with an outside diameter of about 122 thousandths of an inch, which gives them a good secure press fit into the 119 thousandths hole. There's a slight chamfer on them. These are pressed into position and then reamed to bore diameter. Now what I'll do is drill this and press in a plug, and I believe what I'll do is make the plug and drill out the hole. I'll come back, I'll press it in on the camera, we'll locate the spot, we'll drill the pivot and fit it to the escape wheel pivot. This particular pivot is 3/4 of a millimeter in diameter. I measured it here a few moments ago, and that in round numbers is 1/32 of an inch, approximately 30 thousandths of an inch, 32nd being about 32 or 3 thousandths of an inch. So I'll pause on the camera here, and we'll see this unique little tool, how it operates when we get the raw materials made up. A little more than 5 minutes has lapsed since we cut the camera off. I've made the plug that will go in the plate. This looks exactly like a bushing, except there is no hole in it. Now, when we go to turn a piece like this, we have a real problem. This is considerably more difficult to handle than a bushing because there's nothing to hold it by. You recall on the earlier random clock talk that we always kept the bushing strung on a brooch for a handle. One of the early things we did in making the bushing was drill the hole so that we can slip a brooch through it to lift it in and out of the lathe collet, and so that we don't get it lost. When you make this, there's no handle, difficult to handle, difficult to cope with. So the process is a little different in making the bushing. Let's assume that this is the butt of the reamer, but let's assume that this is the stock that we're going to make this from. We go into the lathe, we would face off the end, we would break the edge ever so slightly, we would turn back a slight taper that would be a press fit in the plate hole that we're going to press it into. Then we cut it off. Now at this point of cutoff is when things go different when you're making the plug, different from the bushing. With the bushing we would have drilled a hole, we would take a strong tweezer such as this, broke off the piece with the broach through it, and then we could swap ends, go back in the lathe and face the raw end. In this particular case, we go in with a cutoff tool and we start cutting off. We neck down and we measure the length. We get the length, if I can turn this up on edge, We measure the length here, and we machine that length exactly to the dimension that we're looking for, but we neck down to about the size of a small straight pin, just a few thousandths of an inch in diameter, and then continue back with a small neck back this way. Now we remove it from the lathe in this stock. We find that the plug that we want, the finished piece, is overhanging on a small neck on the end of the stock. We reverse and go into the lathe collet using the parent stock to hold the piece. We go into the lathe collet, we turn it gently to see that the alignment that we run true in the overhang out here snug up the collet. Now we simply take this stock and work it back and forth a little and break it off. So the parent stock has served as the handle until we reach the point of cut-off, break-off. Following that, we go back and face the outside end. We've already started the cut-off, so the length is correct. So we just face the outside end down to the central region. Following that becomes the point that's quite crucial that we don't lose it. What I usually do is hold a cupped hand underneath the headstock of the lathe, loosen the collet, take a piece of wire and run through the headstock and knock it out, catch it in my hand. So that's the process as it differs from making a bushing with a hole. Let's talk about getting this into the plate of the movement. While I was off the camera, I drilled and reamed this pivot hole. This, you recall, the reamer sets that at 119 thousandths. I turned the plug that will go in the hole at about 122 thousandths. Slight taper on it. This has been chamfered on inside and outside with a machinist countersink. You can see this countersink here has a single cutting lip. You will find that that is preferable in countersinking a hole of this type because you have a larger area that rides the hole and it's less prone to chatter or cut unevenly. I just take this in my fingers and give it this type of a roll. Now we said we were going to work this from the inside of the plate. We're working from the inside of the plate because of the inconvenience of the pillars, and we don't want the riveting upset of the pillars out here to rest on the bench block, and we want to be on a solid surface of the block rather than over the holes. Possibly we would do better if we use a different block that has no holes. I may need to back out the camera a little to see this. This is a smooth surfaced block. We want to go into that hole, and let's touch the focus ever so slightly. I think that's about as good as we can do there, and if we can find a place that we can look into that. All right, let's pick up our bushing, and there's a top and bottom to this bushing because it has a taper on it. That begins to enter the hole right there. If I turn it over, I cannot begin to enter the hole. Okay, so we're calling the top side the side that we're pressing from, which looks like this. We have the bushing or the plug lying on the hole, and we'll use a flat-faced, a smooth flat-faced punch to do that. This punch is about 3/8 of an inch in diameter. We'll sit down, and you can hear the stroke as we land down solid. Now let's look at this on both sides of the plate. We have the plug in place. It is flush with the plate there. We have just a tiny ring around this where the chamfer shows. The color of the two materials are slightly different. This has a lacquer on it that's beginning to tarnish a little. And the inside here, we want to be perfectly flush. All right? Now let's use our tool of truth here. We sit these two pivots back here in the prick points that we made previously, and we land down here, and we need to inspect that very carefully to be sure that we are in the two prick positions. I'll take the eye loop down and take a look, and yes, we are. Now, what remains is that we strike this center right there very substantially so that when we drill, that we cannot mistake that center. And when I take a look here, I see the thing that I expected to see. I see that we're right in the center of that plug. Being that our hole was not drifted off, our reamer did drill essentially perfect in that center position. Now the thing that remains is to drill out this hole, broach it to diameter, break the burr that's on the inside, and turn over, and we will cut the oil sink on the outside, and then we'll go through some precautions in workmanship along the way. So I'll turn the camera off here. I'll find a drill and drill this. We said that this is about 3/4 of a millimeter in diameter, about 30 thousandths of an inch as I measured the pivot. I would like to drill this somewhere in the order of about 25 thousandths of an inch, and then we will broach up from that. I would like to broach up, broaching from both sides so that we have a very slight hourglass-shaped hole so that we run approximately on a line contact on the pivot. So we'll pause here. I'll go drill a hole, and we'll return and look further. Returning, we have the hole drilled in this bushing, and I'm calling it a bushing now that it has the hole in it. It was a plug originally. I inspected this very carefully with the eye loop, and when I turned this, I left some tiny rings on the outside end that I could see the central area of it. Tiny tool marks. I'll obscure those later in the operation here. But the thing that I was looking for when we used this pivot locator tool, which was pricked here and there and drilled, I expected this pivot to come back in the exact center of the plug that we had placed in here, because this hole was not drifted off, and I didn't expect my reamer to drift off center in the work. The hole that's drilled is 25 thousandths of an inch, and we notice we can drop that broach in there just ever so slightly. It's passing through about less than 1/4 of an inch. Now the thing we need to know is a judgment position of where that broach will be when the hole is finished. Let's look at the pivot hole in the opposite plate. We find the broach will go approximately halfway through that plate. We're approaching half distance through that plate on the opposite pivot. Let's see if our wheel, the pivot we're looking for, fits that hole. So that gives us an idea when we're approaching the position we're looking for. Now as we turn this broach, I'm turning this with my fingers, and I want to look to see that I am maintaining, turn it this way to the camera, right angle here, here, and then we turn a 1/4 turn, and we want to do the same thing. This is the thing that we're observing. The perspective in the camera may be a little different, but that's the thing that I'm looking for as I broach this hole. This bushing is very hard. It's very, very hard. This is hard bronze stock. It's excellent bushing material. And we'll cut from one side and the other side. And I'm approaching the pivot diameter right here. Let's give it a trial on the fit. And I am just about there. Now let's look at a test situation. We'll take this wheel, and how much can we tip it one way or the other? What would be called a 5-degree running clearance would be, this could be tipped 5 degrees in each direction. And we take this and go round and round and round. Now as I look at that clearance, and rotate the plate, I'm looking for the uprightness of the wheel. I don't want under any circumstance, if this movement is racked, twisted slightly when it's under power, I don't want this pivot to go into a bind. So we look good upright there. Look at it on this side. Got the same situation. This is the direction that it goes into the movement. Now, that looking good, I need to break the burr that's on the hole. There's a little burr right here. I want a slight chamfer in that hole so that if the shoulder of this is not undercut or absolutely square, that I can't run into an in-shake bind there. So I'll pause on the camera, get a little reamer that we can handle that with, and we'll prepare that chamfer. Returning, the thing I'll chamfer this with is a center drill. This is a double-ended center drill, and it is very, very sharp. This bushing is very hard. So we'll go in here, get this about upright to sight, and we just roll this between our fingers a couple of turns and feel for a burr. We'll go back with the broach, touch this very lightly to be sure that there's no burr there. Now let's turn over and do the same thing on the other side. On this side, we're going to do this a little more vigorously because we want to prepare the oil sink here. So I want to cut in a little more in the bushing, and we can do this by hand. I want to inspect this with the glass now, and I believe I'll go just a little bit more. The thing I'm looking for is a countersink, or an oil sink, if you will, at this point. I want the diameter of that oil sink to be about 3 pivot diameters. About 3 pivot diameters. And then we'll take the broach and go back in and remove any possible burr there. Now, we have said that this bushing is made of very, very hard bronze. It says that the necessity for a smoothing broach or a burnishing broach to burnish and harden the hole is not as necessary here as it would be in a brass plate. Now, being that we have shortened the length of that bearing ever so slightly by cutting the oil sink, we will expect this angle that we have here to have increased a bit. I would judge that we're going around here possibly about 3 degrees. I'm looking to see that I can go beyond upright on each axis. That says that there's no danger of bind. Now let's go to our test procedure. Let's just drop this in the escape wheel in the plate. There is nothing else, no other wheel that's meshing with the escape wheel. Drop the plate on and see how we look. We have to, the center wheel is in the movement, So we hook up these two. Having trouble getting the center wheel up in position. There we go. Now I'm holding the plate together, and let's look at this escape wheel spin here. Got a problem. Got a problem. See, that wheel stops quickly. Let's go over here and spin it. See, the wheel spins freely for a much longer period of time. We turn it on this end, and let's look at it again. See, we stop quicker. Let's see if we've got adequate end shake. And yes, we do. So what does this indicate? This indicates that I've got a bind. It's not real great, but I have a bind in this pivot hole. And that bind occurs when I rest pivot down. Now let's touch that chamfer just a little bit more, and let's go in and be sure that we have deburred this. Look at our uprightness again, and we don't want to enlarge the diameter of the pivot, but if there's any problem right there in the hole entry, we want to correct that. I believe that was a hole entry problem. Let's look again. This is probably the most important facet of rebushing a clock, is the inspection to see that we did not place a trouble in the movement as a result of the bushing. Let's see what we've got now. Okay, look at this. See that wheel spin? When we're pinion down, we're on the new bushing. See the freedom that we have for it to spin there. Continues to spin. Still going. There it is, coming to a stop. Let's turn it over, do the same thing. Let's look at it. It's continuing to spin. Still going. 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 There it's coming to a stop. Now that's the type of inspection that we need to know that we have our pivots in order. The thing I'm doing here is obviating latent, intermittent stopping, and obviating the necessity for long periods of test run to see if this movement is going to go. Look at this, how that wheel spins. Still going. All right. The second thing we need to do in this test is to add in the wheel that meshes with it. We want the escape wheel in place, and we want the center wheel. I'm sorry, the center wheel is in place. We want the fourth wheel. Remember, the barrel is first, second, center wheel is third, fourth, escape wheel is fifth. Let's set these in there and be sure that our gearing meshes properly. We'll have to assemble these. There we go. Let's give this a spin. Take a look at that train running on its back. Spin it again. Let's turn it over. Spin it again. I'm holding the plates together against the pillars as if it were assembled. What we find is that there is absolutely no question that we have a good pivot fit. We have it in the proper location. there is no binds or no latent frictional problems, and that we can assemble this movement with the highest degree of confidence that we will be in perfect operation. So this is how you deal with the pivot that has drifted away. Let's try and see if we can get a little closer view of what this pivot looks like in that bushing. Try to focus. We can see that the bushing is brighter than the brass here. The brass has lacquer on it that is beginning to tarnish somewhat. But you see the finished job on it, and this will perform comparable to the original plate, possibly even longer, because that bronze bushing is a harder material than is the approximately half-hard brass that the plate is made from. So that's how it is, and taking care of those extremely worn types of pivot holes. And that's the reason that I do not have too much patience with attempts to close pivot holes and deal likewise. It's just too easy to restore to a much higher class order. This is J.M. Huckabee. I'm on J.B. Ranch, just north of Austin, Texas, and I'm a certified master clockmaker, a fellow with the British Horological Institute. The purpose of these talks is to show younger craftsmen some of the things that I've learned over many years. I'm retired, doing this for fun. Today is the 15th day of December 1987. It is 9:15 in the morning. The sun is very bright. The temperature was down to 25 degrees last night. The air is still, and it looks like it's going to be a beautiful day outside. And I'm going to pull this to a conclusion and get into the outside world for some fresh air. Have a good day. Thank you.